The next bomb she drops has to do with the inflation of COVID-19 infections. And this is a very, very sensitive topic. People, are saying that don't even make that accusation. If you make that accusation, then people are going to take to the streets and say that, there really is no COVID, or it's not as dangerous as we think, and then jeopardize the rest of us. On the other hand, it is very clear that the numbers are being inflated. I mean, we have the Illinois director of the Department of Health that came out like 2.5, 3 weeks ago, admitting that even people dying of chronic diseases in hospices, if they test positive for COVID-19, that is being counted as a COVID-19 death, which to me is, you cannot make it any more clear. She's basically saying that, look, we're inflating the numbers. I mean, that's the only way she can say it.
Well, yeah, didn't she make the distinction? She said that there's a difference in dying with COVID-19 versus dying from COVID-19.
Dr.
So in other words,
yeah.
Yes. So, in other words, somebody could have COVID-19 virus, but that wasn't the primary reason they died. Maybe they had other pre-existing conditions, or some other immune deficiency, or other vulnerability that compounded with COVID-19 caused their death, perhaps. But I looked into that as well, and it actually is very hard, not surprisingly, to find legitimate data on this. I do agree with you. It does seem to be that there's an incentive to inflate the numbers, also both financially. I believe there's a financial incentive to do that as well, correct?
Yeah. Well, you see, here's the thing, right? I mean, like Mickey and Judy point out, you get $13,000 for diagnosing someone with COVID, and $39,000 if that patient needs to be put on a breathing machine, a ventilator, if you will. And people are saying, well, there's your financial incentive. You see, that's why it's happening. That's not really what's going on. I mean, it is very expensive to take care of someone with a respiratory illness in a hospital. I mean, just the isolation precautions alone, the PPEs, the amount of nurses it takes. And then when you put someone in the ICU on a ventilator, that is an enormous expense. And all you folks out there who've ever been in the ICU or had a family member in the ICU, it is extremely expensive. So simply saying that, there's financial incentive in the form of Medicare payments is not really a powerful enough argument to say it's being distorted because of money. But here's the distinction I want to make, David, which is the Bakersfield doctor who is openly saying, why are they telling me to put down COVID? Why are they telling me to put down COVID? And then people say, well, it's because the hospital gets more money. That's fine. Put down COVID, get your money so you can take care of the patient. That's not where the error is happening. That's not where the inflation is happening. Because, we've, like, as a physician myself, I've gotten letters from the Department of Health at the Massachusetts Board of Medicine reminding me how to fill out a death certificate. And it is a very, very subtle or nuanced thing, to talk about what the cause of death was, what the comorbidities are. Once that's submitted, the CDC or the departments of health can do whatever they want to with their data. It has nothing to do with the death certificate. They can say, there was COVID-19 as a contributing factor. Let's count that as a COVID-19 death, right? You see what I'm saying?
Of course, yes.
Are not necessarily being pushed. All they have to do is write it somewhere on the death certificate, and the powers that be that do the tallying can interpret it any way they want to.
No, it's a very good point. And also, I mean, we should also keep in mind that, the stimulus that's been offered to the American people, also businesses, also hospitals, has also triggered sort of a money grab in terms of people trying to claim all of the stimulus funds that are now available in the economy. And there's specific wording, and there's red tape, and there's all types of stuff that goes on behind the scenes to ensure that facilities are funded and are, the beneficiary of some of the stimulus. So there's a lot to it, but your perspective as a physician and your experiences with it are fascinating, I think, for people to listen to as somebody who's in the field and sees how that operates.
Yeah, I would have to say that this is a valid statement that Dr. Mikowits is making. That's all I have to say. I think the numbers are being inflated, and what's really scary is that if you suggest that to someone of the other ilk, they think that you are, you're trying to take down society. Like, don't even make that accusation. But it's happening. And, one has to really question why. Why would we be doing that? That doesn't make any sense at all. Right now, we should be looking for absolute accuracy. To be so obtuse in how we're counting this up has huge implications as to how we're handling this pandemic. What is the next step? If we have the wrong numbers, how are we going to make the right, choose the right course of action? So this is a statement that Judy is making that I support.
Yeah, what is interesting, I'll just add to that, is that, in the United States, you do see, a continual death count, infection count that is rapidly, accelerating every day. So, there does seem to be coverage ratcheting up those numbers, just anecdotally, but juxtaposed with, what a government like China is doing, they seem to be underreporting. So it seems to be interesting just in terms of how different, countries are responding to this. And the United States, obviously, we are, at the epicenter of the crisis, particularly in New York. But from your perspective, are we getting the accurate information? And that's what I think people are going to be left with questioning. How, what are the reliable sources? Is Dr. Mikowits reliable? Is Dr. Fauci reliable? The answer to both of those is no. Then what are reliable sources?
There are none. Let's face it. I mean, that's why this is so interesting. Is we have to use our own wits to figure out what's going on here. And you bring up an excellent point. Like, why is the United States over-reporting and China under-reporting? Let's just stop for a second and analyze that question. And I don't want to just give you why would that be happening? Right? This is a very interesting question, and we don't have any basis to answer that, but what is a possibility?
Sure. Well, a clear possibility, and you're already seeing this. I mean, China has been lauded in some respects for its response to the crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, they've instituted very draconian measures. Mm-hmm. They employ a surveillance state. They track their entire population. They have tracking apps that tell people where they can go, when they can go, to who they can go see. Heavily controlled society. So, if we're looking at that as a model that the West needs to emulate, there clearly is an agenda there that would be pushing towards more control, and also that would also create a slip of our civil liberties that we've grown accustomed to in the West. So something to consider, but we will talk about that as well.
That's exactly right. I mean, we don't know that's the reason why it's happening, or even if it is happening, but that's why it should raise some red flags to people who are really keeping an open mind about all possibilities. Is that if it is happening, clearly doesn't smell good.
Indeed. So why don't we move on to our lightning rod, right? Vaccines.
Yes.
So, because she also, of course, made provocative statements on her opinion of vaccines, while noting that she's not an anti-vaxxer. In fact, she, her research was centered around creating effective vaccines but also mitigating the risk of those vaccines. Correct?
That's exactly right. I mean, well, she puts it all into I develop immunotherapies, and vaccines are immunotherapies. And she says unwaveringly that she is not anti-vaccinations. She is anti-dirty vaccinations, and what does that mean? I don't know. First of all, this just brings up so many different things. And what I don't like is when people just dismiss her because, she's an anti-vax nut job. She's not. She's not anti-vax. I mean, she spent her life, developing these kinds of interventions and knows a heck of a lot about these things. And to just label her as anti-vax and dismiss her as being unhinged is completely unfair because there's a lot to vaccinations and the history of vaccinations in this country, as you know. So Mickey opens up this line of questioning with Judy. regarding the potential of being at increased risk to coronavirus if you've received a flu vaccination. What did you make of that?
Well, I would defer to your expertise on that. But I mean, again, because that's something I haven't researched, and I'll be the first to admit I haven't researched that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm sort of more curious, as someone who has not researched it, to hear that. I mean, how does that feel with you? Is that like, that's ridiculous, that could never happen, or is it something you're willing to consider?
Well, I as somebody who at various times I have received the flu vaccine, at various times I haven't. In the past 10 years, I have not.
Mm-hmm.
I think a discussion we don't have enough is analyzing whether it's productive for a healthy person to take a flu vaccine, for example. And then, I know we had a discussion about this previously, and I believe the flu vaccine is essentially 5% effective.
Well, yes, that's a very good question. When you hear, the statistics on the protective efficacy of a vaccination or a flu vaccination, they talk about it in terms of relative risk, which means how much greater are your chances of getting the flu if you don't get a vaccine compared to if you do. And that number, the best flu vaccinations we've ever developed, confer a relative risk reduction of about 60 to 70%. That means you have a 60% less chance of getting the flu if you get the vaccine. Now, how do you interpret that piece of data depends on how you feel about vaccinations. Because if vaccinations had no side effects, none at all, of course you would get the vaccine. Why wouldn't you get the vaccine, right? On the other hand, if you believe there is some threat or some side effect that you don't want to have, you then have to look at it a little bit more closely and say, what are the chances I'm going to get the flu in the first place if I don't get vaccinated? And that number is somewhere around 6 to 7% in a flu season, compared to if you get a vaccination, then your risk of getting the flu is about 2%. And I'm taking these numbers from double-blind placebo-controlled studies where some people get the placebo, some people get the shot, and then they look at the numbers. And so what we're really talking about here is, a 4% risk reduction, the absolute risk of getting the flu. And if you're really worried about, the side effects, you would say, why would I get the flu shot? It's like a 4% risk reduction. But yet the CDC and the public puts out, it's a 67%, benefit. And they're not wrong, but they're not exactly right either. It depends on how you look at it. But what Judy is saying here, and she is bringing up a study that was done on members of the Department of Defense, the soldiers. We saw the soldiers lining up for the shots in the thing, and they got I believe this was 2017 to 2018. That flu season, they got the flu shot. And it was noted that they were more susceptible than those who did not receive the shot to coronaviruses specifically. This phenomenon is called viral interference, which means that when you develop natural immunity, you're exposed to a pathogen, a virus, and it makes you resistant to getting a superinfection from related viruses. It happens. That's the natural way our bodies and immune system react. But if you get an inoculation that artificially makes you immune to a specific strain of viruses, you don't always have that same broad kind of resistance to other viruses. And in this study, the researcher found that there was a 36% increase in your susceptibility to coronaviruses. So
Right.
that was it was that particular strain of that flu strain, the vaccination strain, and with coronaviruses, not COVID-19 specifically, but coronaviruses. So there's nothing wrong with that statement. She's absolutely right. That paper was in Vaccine Magazine that came out in October of 2019, and that is exactly what it says. So that is not a misinterpretation or a skewing of the facts.
Hey, my takeaway from this is again, first of all, it's another highly polarized subject, right? Either people are anti-vaccine or they're love every vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
But we're seeing in terms of the solutions being presented, obviously Bill Gates is famous for saying, "Oh, nothing's going to get back to normal until everyone's vaccinated." Right? That's a pretty provocative statement. And you also have a lot of people in the public echoing that, saying, "Oh, we shouldn't even think about reopening anything until the vaccine is developed and administered widely." And let's talk about that a little bit, because what I find interesting is that there's not a lot of emphasis on advising people to naturally build up their immune systems, to exercise and increase blood flow and give them some natural defenses to all the bacteria and viruses that we encounter on a daily basis. The idea that we could just shelter in place, for months, even years, until a vaccine is developed, and then all of a sudden the vaccine is going to be this magical boost that's going to make everyone feel comfortable with traveling and being exposed to the world around us, which is a world filled with, again, bacteria and virus every day. As human beings, we're touching each other, we're touching doorknobs, we're touching our pets, we're touching things that are going to introduce bacteria and other substances into our system, and we naturally defend those off. So it seems to me that the solutions being presented will only weaken the immune system to the point where it becomes increasingly susceptible. So from your perspective, is it sound advice as a physician, but also from a scientific perspective, to think that the only viable solution to this is to develop a vaccine and widely administer it?
Well, as I said before, the best we've ever done in terms of conferring immunity against a flu virus like corona has been 68% of relative risk reduction. And the worst we've ever done was just a few years ago. It was 12 to 19%, which is, almost, it's laughable, honestly. That's like nothing. So to think that we're somehow going to have like you said, something that makes us feel comfortable. A vaccination shouldn't make you feel comfortable, especially, when we look at the kinds of brutal deaths that very, very young and healthy people are suffering from COVID-19. We're not gonna have a vaccine that is going to be able to protect us with any real, without any real security. There's going to be a lot of people who would get a vaccine if they're vaccinated, if they choose to get vaccinated, but that doesn't make them safe at all.
And there's also no guarantee that we can even develop a vaccine for this, correct?
That's exactly right. I mean, if you wanted to do actually, safety and efficacy studies on a vaccination, that would take years. We know that. So, and this is where we all need to be very, very aware. These things don't happen in a matter of months. So if there is a vaccine that is offered to the public, we have to assume that it did not meet the same standards for safety that perhaps other vaccines in the past have. So this is an extremely important piece of information to keep in mind when we decide whether or not, if we have the power to decide whether we get a vaccination.
Right, and isn't it one thing to say that we should, develop a vaccine if it's possible, and protect the most vulnerable in society, the people who suffer from immunodeficiency, or the elderly, or just people who, in general, might be more susceptible to it. Isn't it one thing to say we're directing our focus there versus we're directing our focus to, get everyone to issue a vaccine to everyone in a fashion to where that's the only thing, as Bill Gates claims, that can really bring us back to any sense of normalcy?
That's an excellent point, because really, here's the thing. Why would you accept a vaccination if you have developed natural immunity to a disease? There's no reason to get vaccinated.
Right. The only reason I would, for example, is if, right, um, it was mandatory to have it on a vaccine card to travel, right? If they
Well,
impede your mobility, that's where you'll see people opt in, right?
exactly. Of course you're right. I mean, this is why it's so difficult right now to accept vaccinations, and why the discussion around it is so difficult, because people who see this as a limit to their freedom to move and engage in society will look at a vaccination, independent of the science, as being a massive restriction of their freedom. But here's the thing. Let's go back to the vaccines for a second. There's no reason for you to get vaccinated if you have natural immunity to something, right? So
Correct.
here's what's fascinating, right? We're talking about, or at least Bill Gates and the WHO and the CDC, they're not coming out and saying everyone's going to get vaccinated, but that's being put into the narrative. Why not, instead of vaccinating everybody, testing everybody, and then pick the people that who have not developed natural immunity, and perhaps even focus your attention on people who don't have natural immunity yet and who are immunocompromised. Let them have the vaccinations. But we don't hear about that. Like, I haven't. Have you?
No, I think they're developing now tests that can test for antibodies, right?
Mhm.
But you're right. No, I haven't seen that as a solution, which to me is a much more efficient. That's something that can be achieved in a faster time frame,
Mhm.
and also it puts less stress on the medical system. As opposed to trying to round up everybody and develop a sort of a one size fits all approach.
Correct. That would be a much more sensible approach. And again, now we're always, like, in this particular piece that we're talking about here. We're dealing with subtleties. There's no cut and dry answers to any of these questions that Judy brings up. What is our approach? What is the history of vaccinations? Like, she brings up dirty vaccination. She's not anti-vaccination. She is saying, you have to understand, there is like a lot of stuff in these vaccines.
Yeah, Madhava, what are dirty vaccines?
Dirty vaccines are ones that, the idea is to offer the antigen or the virus in an attenuated form that will not cause an infection in the host or the recipient. However, these viruses in the vaccines have been grown in culture, and there are going to be bits and pieces of the cellular line in which they were grown that don't get spun out of the vaccine because that would be too expensive. There's preservatives in the form of ethyl mercury. Mercury is one of the most powerful neurotoxins that known to exist on this planet, at least naturally. There's formaldehyde, which was used to kill and attenuate the antigen that remains, not necessarily in huge quantities, but in trace quantities. There are detergents. There's aluminum salts, which tend to make the immunologic response greater. That's just what it does. You have a better response if you put in aluminum salts. Aluminum is extremely bad for your body. So there's, her point is like, look, there's a way to offer vaccinations that are clean. And why aren't we making our vaccines clean? It's a little bit more expensive, but this is possibly the biggest point of all this, is that suddenly, up to 1983, there was, I don't know, something like 10 or 12 vaccines that were the CDC recommended over the course of your youth and childhood. But after 1986, something happened. Suddenly we have multiple vaccinations, for things we never used to get vaccinated for, like HPV and flu vaccines every season. What happened in 1986, David?
Right. Well, there was clearly a pivotal moment in 1986 when there was legal discussion on how to indemnify vaccine manufacturers and basically hold them immune from any litigation. So actually, this happened in 1988. 42 U.S. Code Section 300, which states that no vaccine manufacturer shall be liable for damages arising from a vaccine-related injury or death associated with the administration of a vaccine after October 1st, 1988. So effectively what this did was relieve any pressure or liability or responsibility from the vaccine manufacturers in developing safe vaccines, because they knew that if a family had complications with the vaccine and their baby suffered, horrendous side effects or even death, that family would not be able to sue the vaccine manufacturer under this code.
And then the number of recommended vaccines exploded. Like, these aren't made up, laws or numbers. This is exactly what's going on. This is why, it's very important not to just simply throw away any anti-vax argument. There's something, to this, right? And when people say there's no side effects to vaccinations, or very few, except for a sore arm and a fever, and you may get some symptoms, that is not true at all. Until you've spoken to a mother who had a healthy, bubbly, interactive 2-year-old and remembers when she went and got a number, a set of vaccinations from her pediatrician, and the child completely changed and was diagnosed eventually with autism. I've spoken to people like that, and there's no discounting that. Like, why would this person, make this up? And secondly, as an anesthesiologist, I've given people medicines like safe antibiotics that are generally and commonly used all the time, and literally 90 seconds later, or a little bit later than that, I'm resuscitating this person from cardiovascular collapse. This is, anaphylaxis, or a very, very, horrible response to what's supposed to be a safe medicine or intervention happens. So for anyone to say, oh, vaccinations, that doesn't happen. No, it can happen. That's where I have a problem. I'm not saying that no one should get vaccinations. I'm into, cleaning them up. But to think that, we can expect that this kind of intervention will never have a really bad side effect is very short-sighted. Of course it happens. Don't say that it doesn't happen. We can find a way to safely vaccinate people, or change the way we modulate our immune system, but don't tell me that vaccinations are safe 100%.
Well, right. In fact, I mean, from a legal perspective, there would be no need to protect the vaccine manufacturers with this kind of code, unless there were damages resulting from the vaccine. So
I love what you said, is that why were these vaccine manufacturers indemnified? And then we now have many more vaccinations. And look, I'm gonna throw some things out there. Like, I don't have proof of this, right? But just because we're talking about paradigm shifts here, we're talking about, like, how do we look at this? We have this researcher saying this one thing, we have the CDC saying something else, you have people on both sides. Like, when I was a kid, you didn't have, none of my classmates came to school with EpiPens, There was no EpiPen. Yeah. Well, like now, like peanuts now are different. Let's just stop and take a look at, like, maybe we've done something to our immune systems that have made them hyper responsive and weaker from immunizations. Because when I was growing up, there weren't, 19, 20, 25 vaccinations that we had to receive before getting out of middle school like we do now. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that peanut allergies are from, mandatory vaccinations, but something is happening, and I don't know what it is. And it is imprudent to just dismiss the possibility that vaccinations may be contributing to our immune system development.